But what we're going to be more focused on exclusively
Hello, this is Mrs. Ness-Deden, and it is Thursday today. When we left off on Tuesday, we were talking about the competitive exclusion principle, the fact that no two species in an ecosystem can share the exact same niche because there would be too much competition and one of them would outcompete, would do a little bit better than the others. Today, we're going to continue talking about this idea. We're going to look at some examples of different ways that this can happen. And we're also going to see how this helps to increase the amount of biodiversity that we find within an ecosystem. What we call this kind of separation of resources among species, we call this either resource partitioning or niche partitioning. Those are two different phrases that mean essentially the same thing. And this is an example of how resource partitioning or niche partitioning can work. The figure that you see here shows relative grazer density at different times after the peak rain. The grass shown below the graph shows the relative height of the grass at each point in time on the graph. Population counts were done in the same area and numbers were normalized to the maximum count. That just means they kind of controlled for any unusual variation. As you look at this graph, you should notice a few different patterns in the populations here. As we look at this, first you can see that the grass, which is down here underneath the x-axis, gets shorter the longer the time goes. So right after the peak rain, it's very tall and lush, and it gets shorter and shorter as it goes. You'll also notice we have three different species here, and their peak density occurs at different times. These three species, the zebra, the wildebeest, and the gazelle, have kind of separated, they have partitioned these resources, in this case in terms of time. The zebra's population kind of spikes shortly after the peak rain because that's when the grass is tall, there's tons of good vegetation available to them. And as they start chewing it down and shortening that grass, they are kind of making that grass less appealing to them and more appealing to the wildebeest, which is kind of the next population to spike. And same kind of thing, as they graze down that grass, it gets shorter and a little harder to digest. And so the zebras and the wildebeest can't eat as much of it, but the gazelles are very good at chewing that short little grass that's left. And so then their population spikes. So these three species can coexist even though they're eating the same grass because they eat it at different times. We're going to watch a short video here that will give you a few more examples of how niche partitioning or resource partitioning can happen. And I want you to take some notes on the different types of niche partitioning and kind of how this can occur.
But what we're going to be more focused on, exclusively focused on today, is what we call bottom-up mechanisms. And that involves competition between ecologically similar species and how that leads to what we call niche partitioning. So differentiation in resource use, okay? Now, there's a couple of different ways you can think about niche partitioning. You can think about it in space. So here are 6 different antelope species that are coexisting in a sort of grassy, open woodland savanna with a little swamp in it. And they're occupying particular niches in this habitat. So the reedbuck in the reeds over there, the nyala in the deep woods. And this is a common form of niche partitioning. It's associated with the ecologist Joseph Grinnell. And another classic example you guys might have come across is anolis lizards, which partition the vertical tree canopy. So ungulates, or large hoofed mammals, can do that too. Dietary niche partitioning is another key mechanism that we need to consider. And the way this has been thought about in the case of these big, large mammals here is largely in terms of something called the grazer-browser spectrum. So over here on the left, we have zebra. That's a grazer, means it eats predominantly grass. And over there on the right, we have a dik-dik, and it eats almost exclusively non-grass or browse. And for those of you guys who don't know what a dik-dik looks like, it's a 5-kilogram antelope. We happen to have a replica skull here. So that's dik-dik, and it's got, if we were to look at the cranial morphology and the teeth of that replica, we'd be able to see adaptations to a browsing lifestyle, or rather, we'd be able to see the absence of adaptations to a grazing lifestyle. And then in the middle, we have what we call mixed feeders. So this impala might eat a 50-50 mix of both grasses and browse. Okay, so that's the grazer-browser spectrum. Another form of dietary niche partitioning is that animals can separate out by height. All right, so this one should make intuitive sense. If you've got 3 large browsers, again, browsers being the ones that eat trees and don't eat grasses. So here we have giraffe, kudu, and steinbuck, and feeding along a height axis on a tree. And the proportion of time that they spend feeding is there on the x-axis, and you see the giraffe spends most of the time feeding on the tall parts of the tree, the kudu at the intermediate parts, and the steinbuck at the lowest parts. Believe it or not, something similar is true for how grazers partition their grass. So we have, again, our one grass species. This is our Panicum maximum buffalo grass. This is from examples from the Serengeti, where they have a long dry season. And when the rains come, the grass grows tall. And the first herbivores to move in to start foraging on that tall grass are zebra, which they're non-ruminant and large body-sized animals, which means they have to eat a lot of food and they don't digest it very thoroughly. So that's kind of their strategy. So they move in and they eat this grass, which is relatively low quality, has a lot of stems. They're followed by wildebeests, who prefer grass of a slightly intermediate height and slightly higher quality, because as the grass gets shorter, then we're getting to the more nutritious parts of it. And lastly, the smallest and most selective herbivore species, Thompson's gazelle, is feeding at the smallest, the shortest grass that you find sort of 6 months after the rain, after the other herbivores have passed through. And this is a phenomenon known as grazing succession, and it also relates to a concept known as facilitation, because zebra are thought to be sort of preparing, if you will, the range or the pasture for wildebeest, and wildebeest further prepare it for Thompson's gazelle. So they're actually a positive as opposed to a competitive interaction among these species in this situation.
All right. So those are several different ways that niche partitioning or resource partitioning can happen. And all of those are important in an ecosystem because they allow for a higher level of biodiversity. And this actually is kind of our theme for the week. We were looking at biodiversity in a pond ecosystem. We are talking about how niche partitioning can lead to biodiversity. And we're going to use this concept to tie together all the things we've been doing this week. When we look at biodiversity, there are 2 main components. We can look at species richness. That's how many different species exist within that community. And this one's pretty intuitive. Obviously, if there are more species, you have more biodiversity. But there's another component to it as well. We also take a look at the relative abundance, and that's basically looking at how many of each different species there are within that community, or what proportion. And you can think of this one, if we're in a community, a biological community that has 5 different species, and there are 20 of each different species, that's a pretty good diverse community. But if we have still that same total of 100 individuals, but 95 of them are all the same kind, and then there's just a couple each of 4 other species, that's much less diverse. So a truly biodiverse ecosystem has a lot of different species in decent proportions of each. It's not dominated by any one single species. And we can use an equation to calculate the biodiversity that incorporates both of these aspects, the species richness and the relative abundance. This is another equation off of your equation and formula sheet. And I want to talk a little bit about these. So the equation here, Simpson's diversity index, measures diversity on a scale from 0 to 1. So 0 would be the lowest possible, like no diversity. And 1 is the highest this can go. 1 is like infinite diversity. So any number that you get for this, you can always kind of check your own math, because if it's not in the range between 0 and 1, you did something wrong in your calculation. Within this equation, you have 1 minus the sum of little n over capital N squared. The little n represents the number of individuals of a single species. The capital N is the total number of all the individuals of all species within that biological community. So that number of individuals of one species out of the total, that gives you the proportion, kind of that relative abundance piece. And then the other piece, this may or may not be something that you're real familiar with mathematically. That funny looking capital E thing is a summation sign. And what that means is you have to do this calculation, the number of individuals divided by the total number squared. So you do this whole thing once for every single species in the entire community. And then this summation means you need to add them all up. So in a true biological community, this calculation can take a while. It's not incredibly difficult. You can do it in a calculator, but sometimes it gets very long because you have to do that n, lowercase n divided by capital N squared for every single species in the ecosystem, add those all together, and then you take 1 minus that number that you just got. That gives us the diversity index. And here are a couple of things to think about with that. If we consider an individual or an area with 100 total individuals that are all the same species, let's do that calculation real quick. We only have one species here. They're all the same. So that makes this math a little easier because we don't have to sum anything up. So we end up with 1 minus 100 individuals of this species out of a total of 100 individuals. And this part is squared. 100 divided by 100 is 1. 1 squared is 1. 1 minus 1. As you could probably predict, this ecosystem has diversity of 0 because they're all the same species. It's what we call a monoculture. It's all the same thing. So that's kind of the very lowest end of this diversity index. If we have 1 each of 100 different species, you could go through and calculate that one, but you're going to get a much bigger number because then this part with the summation sign is going to be 1 divided by 100 squared plus 1 divided by 100 squared plus 1 divided by 100 squared 100 times. And that's going to give this a really, really tiny, this summation is going to end up being a really small number. So our overall answer is going to be approaching 1, which is the highest range of this diversity index. We're going to use this diversity index to actually go back and look at the pond water community, and we'll talk about it in some other places as well. This is one of those equations that you need to be able to work with and understand what it means. For today, though, we are going to look at biodiversity in a little different way. We are going to be doing an online lab activity today, and the point of this is to answer this question. How does food web complexity affect the biodiversity of an ecosystem? So we're going to start looking at some of those interactions within a community and see how they affect the biodiversity of that ecosystem over time. The link to the simulation is on today's classroom post. When you first go to that simulation, you will see a website that looks like this. Right here is where you need to click to open this simulator. And when you do that, it will bring you to a website that looks like this. This gives you 3 different things. The place that you can kind of manipulate the food web complexity is in this upper left-hand corner. And you can see it has a basic structure. There are some plants, herbivores, a couple omnivores, and a top predator. And you can choose which of these are included in your food web. So we can say, I want to include this grass. And you see over here, it starts to build your ecosystem. It put a whole bunch of grass there. And then you can say, I want this herbivore to eat plant A, that plant that I just selected. And this herbivore is also going to eat plant A. Then I'm going to have this omnivore who eats a plant, and he eats herbivore B. And this guy, let's see, he's going to eat an herbivore, and he's going to eat my omnivore, my squirrel. So you can see you kind of get a picture of your food web that it's drawing as you go. And it has added all of those creatures in realistic type proportions to your ecosystem. Then when you click the run button up here above the food web, it will show you kind of how the dynamics of those populations change over time. And you can see it's illustrating it up here in the picture, but it's also developing this graph for you to show what happens to your ecosystem over time. And you can see here, most of our populations, and it has them labeled in a key, went down to 0 very quickly. We only had 2 that kind of stabilized and stayed in existence at a decent population rate. So your goal here, we're looking at how food web complexity affects biodiversity. The most complex this food web can be, if you turn them all on, there you've got all the things, you can run this again and see what happens. And your goal with this really is to have the highest biodiversity that's sustainable over time, which means in your graph, you should have lots of those colored lines. They don't all need to be super high. Remember, a top predator is never going to have a huge population, but the important thing is that you have lots of lines that remain steady over a long period of time. So you're going to play with that today. As you go, you should record your data in a Google Doc. And in order to answer this question, the data that you'll need is the food web and that graph that shows your biodiversity. So you might want to actually take some snips or screenshots of the food webs or the graphs and jot some notes, like type some notes into your Google Doc so you can remember why you set it up like that and some things about what happened. There's some questions on the lab instruction document that will help kind of guide you through this and think about it a little bit more. So you can read through that for some extra tips. Try to be intentional about why you're setting things up the way you are. Try not to just randomly guess and check and see if you happen to stumble across something. Think intentionally about how can you vary the complexity of your food web to measure biodiversity. Just so you have an idea of where we're going with this, today the main goal is to gather enough data. And you'll probably have to run several simulations of this, but as you saw, they go pretty quickly. Tomorrow, you're going to be taking that data and using it to write a claim answering this question: how does food web complexity affect the biodiversity of an ecosystem? Is it better to have a very complex food web or a very simple one or somewhere in between? You will need to include some evidence. So that's why it's important that you are snipping pictures of your food webs and the graphs that you generate today. And then you'll need to include some reasoning and see if you can come up with an explanation for why a certain level of food web complexity leads to the highest amount of biodiversity. So that's kind of where we're going with this over the next day or two. If you have any further questions as you're working on this simulation, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, we will continue talking about biodiversity and food web complexity tomorrow. I hope you have a great day.